Hi, everyone, and welcome to Discoveries Chats with Changemakers. I'm your host, Tiffany, a 10th grader in Texas, and each month I meet with different guests from the engineering community. Today is Introduce a Girl to Engineering Day, and I'm so excited to celebrate with this special episode as part of Discoveries Engineers Week activities. Today's guest is Joan Higginbotham, an electrical engineer at Collins Aerospace and a retired NASA astronaut. In 2006, Ms. Higginbotham and the crew of STS-116 flew aboard Space Shuttle Discovery on a mission to the International Space Station. Ms. Higginbotham, welcome. We are so thrilled for you to join us today.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. Happy Introduce a Girl to Engineering Day. I am glad to be here with you. How are you doing today?
So I'm going to ask Ms. Higginbotham a few questions to get to know a little more about her. You can ask questions too by typing in your question in the Q&A box below, and we will save time to answer some. We also received some audience questions in advance, and we'll ask those along the way. Also, be sure to stay tuned until the end of today's session when we will introduce a hands-on engineering challenge that you can try at home. So, Ms. Higginbotham, many kids dream of becoming an astronaut, and you did it. Can you tell us how? What was your career path at NASA to become an astronaut?
So I didn't always want to become an astronaut, Tiffany. My goal was to become an electrical engineer, and my interest in that started when I was in about 8th grade. And so I was introduced to a program called En-ROADS, which at that time was a pre-engineering program for women and minorities. And so I majored in electrical engineering in college, and I just thought I was going to work for IBM because I worked for them for 2 summers. But they were not hiring engineers when I was about to graduate college. In the meantime, NASA, someone from NASA, Florida's Kennedy Space Center, called me and asked me if I wanted to come to Florida to launch shuttles. And I said, I'm not sure, but I went down to Florida. I got to see a shuttle and I got to see a launch pad, and it looked like something out of Star Wars. And I was like, I'm moving to Florida to launch space shuttles. And that's what I did. And about 9 years into my career, someone suggested that I applied to be an astronaut. And that's how that journey began.
Wow, that's so cool how the opportunity just came up and then one thing led to another and you got to experience so many cool things.
Absolutely. And I always tell people, always be aware and available to take advantage of opportunities that may come your way.
So not every astronaut gets to travel into space. So what was involved in getting chosen for a mission?
So Tiffany, that is a widespread misconception. Of all the astronauts that have been chosen, people have been chosen to be astronauts, I can think of maybe 5 or 6 who have never flown into space. So I'd probably say about 95, 96% of anyone who has gone through astronaut training and has passed that has actually flown on a mission. But to answer your question, there are 2 great mysteries that astronauts say that there are. The first one is how you're selected to be an astronaut, and the second one is how you're selected to go on a mission. And I would have to say, if I was to, guess at the answer, is that they look at the crew makeup, the experience, how many people are first-time flyers versus how many people have flown before, because you want some experience on the crew, and you want some new people flying every time so that those people become experienced crew members. And then you look at the skill set. So I think those are probably 2 of the bigger things that they look at when they're trying to pick out who's going to be on what particular crew.
I didn't know that so many people don't actually get to go on missions even if they've flown on space, but that's pretty cool.
So yeah, like I said, I think of all the astronauts, I think there have been roughly 350 or so American astronauts. I can literally think of 6 people who have not flown in space. Everybody else has flown in space.
Wow. So what role did your electrical engineering abilities play in being an astronaut? Did it help you to become an astronaut?
I think it did help me become an astronaut because it's one of the qualifying degrees that you need to become an astronaut. They're looking for people that have, STEM backgrounds, engineering, the biological sciences, the physical sciences, and some doctors as well. And so I think the fact that I had a degree in electrical engineering helped me in my qualifications. And when I became an astronaut, I think it really helped me because I had the ability to actually understand what was going on, probably more so or easier than some of my colleagues because I had the advantage of launching shuttles for 9 years and working on the electrical systems. So I already had a good sense of what they did and how they operated. I just had to look at it from a different perspective. When I first joined NASA, I was a fixer of the shuttle, if you will. But then when I became an astronaut, I was an operator of the shuttle.
That's cool that your previous experiences like helped you to like on the mission itself.
It did. I was so familiar with the shuttle at that time because I had spent 9 years basically working on it almost every single day. So it was just like breathing to me. I knew where all the switches were, and I was just familiar with the vehicle.
So our next question is from Miss Poole's fifth grade class. How did it feel to become an astronaut and have the responsibility to go into space?
So, how did it feel to become an astronaut? It was phenomenal. The day that I got selected, I was so excited. I called everybody, let them know. And it was even more special because it was my second attempt at becoming an astronaut. I had actually applied 2 years earlier with 6,000 other people. I was one of the lucky 122 people that actually got an interview, but I was ultimately not one of the 15 selected. So I'm pretty bummed out about that, obviously. So, I got more education. I went through the process again. I was selected. So obviously that second time was sweet, and I really enjoyed that phone call. And I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Well, just like how did it feel to have the responsibility to go into space?
So it was a little bit daunting to know that I had all this responsibility and I needed to really perform because I had to pull my weight on the mission. There were seven of us and we each had our specialties, and we were relying on the other person to really nail their specialty. So that was a little daunting. But once I went through all the training, I felt very confident in the tasks that I had to perform, and I felt that I was going to be a phenomenal crewmate to my other phenomenal crewmates. And so after all that, it was just exhilaration at being able to represent my country in such a unique way.
Definitely. And it's really neat how much teamwork and communication I bet really played into that.
Absolutely, because in engineering, you do your work and you have to make sure that it's right. And sometimes you do it by yourself, sometimes you do it in teams. When you fly on the shuttle, it is all about the team. And if somebody messes up, it kind of affects everything. So there is really importance in the whole team dynamics and how we all got along. And to your point, how we all communicated with one another, because that could either make the mission successful or not so much. And lucky for us, we had a great crew, we had great communications, we had great chemistry, therefore we had a great mission.
That's awesome. So what kind of training did you have to go through to prepare to be an astronaut?
So there are two type of trainings. I kind of categorize them in two different ways. So one is like basic training. So when you get to be an astronaut, there is a shuttle operating manual that is almost 1,200 pages long,
Oh
and
my
you have
gosh.
to know every single system on the shuttle. So it's like being in school. We actually sit through classes and have the instructors teach us about the nuances of the systems. Then we had to learn how to fly jets, and we had to do water survival and land survival just in case we had to eject out of the jet, which thank God I never had to. So that's kind of the basic training. We also had to do training for the International Space Station because at the time I was coming along, we were just starting to build it and put it in orbit. So that's part one. That's like your basic training. Part two is when you get assigned to a mission. Once you get that assignment, you now have specific things you need to learn that are specific to that mission. And that training is about a year long for people who have never flown before, and roughly 9 months long for anybody who's a repeat flyer, because there's some things you don't have to take twice. So it is a long process, and it's interesting and it's very exciting, but it takes a couple of years to be fully trained to be an astronaut.
Yeah, that sounds like such an extensive process, but that's cool.
It
So
is.
what was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said it is, but I tell you, Tiffany, it's definitely worth it.
So what was the goal of your 2006 Space Shuttle Discovery mission to the International Space Station?
So our mission was to take up another piece of the space station hardware as we were building it at the time. And we took up an element, they call it P5, P meaning port, meaning the left side of the shuttle, because that's where it was going to go. We nicknamed it puny because it was probably one of the smaller elements of the space station. And ours was a spacer. And what that is, it basically provided space in between two solar arrays. So we had a solar array that we were going to put here and one here, and they had to rotate. And if they were too close together, when they rotated, they would hit one another. So we put our spacer in between the two solar arrays so that they could rotate freely. We also rewired the entire space station. So we powered down half of the space station one day. The guys went out and made some electrical connections and we powered it back up. Thank God it worked. We did the other half of the space station 2 days later, basically the same thing. And then we took up about 6,000 pounds of equipment because you have to realize on the space station, there's only so much space you have. So you don't have room for everything. So every time a space shuttle would go, it would take up necessary equipment and then bring down equipment that the astronauts on board the space station no longer needed.
That's so cool how your mission made such an impact on the International Space Station.
Absolutely. Everybody's mission did at that time because, as I said, we were building it. So it was like taking a Lego block, putting one up and then put another one next to it, another one. And that's how we basically built the space station over an 11-year period.
Wow. So 11-year-old Riley wants to know what it felt like launching into space. She asked, does your stomach feel weird when you go up into space like butterflies on a roller coaster?
No, you don't get that dropping, sinking feeling like you do when you're going down the hill of a roller coaster. When we launched off the pad, there was like a little kick in the pants. So we found out you had a good jolt because there's 7 million pounds of thrust kicking you off the launch pad. So you felt that. And then it was interesting because I could hear it was like a hum that the shuttle had. And as we were going faster and faster, you can just kind of hear a little hum in the shuttle. And then you really didn't feel anything till about 6 minutes into the flight, where you actually experienced the most amount of G forces. And we called it force in because it felt like an elephant was sitting on your chest, and it was roughly 3.5 G's. So it was really hard to breathe out. And your breathing was very labored. But then once we got past that point, at 8.5 minutes after we launched, we were in space and we were ready to float.
Wow, that's cool. I didn't know that like the G-force didn't kick in till like a couple minutes later, and like I would have thought that it would be like a roller coaster, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a really smooth ride. Well, it's probably the first 2.5 minutes, it's a little rickety because you have all that power. And if you've ever ridden one of those really old wooden roller coasters as you're going up the hill, it's kind of, kind of getting jerked. That's what it felt for like the first 2.5 minutes. But once the boosters separated, it was a really smooth ride into orbit.
That's nice. So many students in our audience want to know how it feels in space. Like, what was the feeling of being weightless like?
So it really didn't feel like anything too much, obviously. And it didn't take tons of effort because all you had to do was unstrap and you were floating. You have no choice but to float. But while you were there were some things that we were really trying to do. So when we docked with the International Space Station, we had 3 astronauts that were on board and they had been up in space for a couple of months. And so they had the ability to just kind of levitate right there. When you're a first time space flyer and you're floating for the first time, you kind of bob and weave around. But these guys, they were just steady. And so you knew that you were really proficient at floating once you could just hold yourself steady. The other thing that you had to get used to was finessing your way from one place to another. So obviously you're going to float, you have no choice in the matter. But if you wanted to get to point A to point B, you would push off from one wall and go to the surface. So here's the tricky part. If you pushed off too hard from one wall, you'd go flying into another surface, and you didn't want that to happen. And if you didn't push off hard enough, you'd find yourself like in the middle of a module with like nowhere to go. So you kind of have to get a little momentum going so that you could get to another surface to push off. So that was the trick to floating proficiently in space.
That sounds a little tricky.
It can be. And about the 3rd day, I had it down. The first 2 days, I was like a fish out of water.
So what was the most challenging part of the mission?
So for me, I think the most challenging part of the mission was when we had a task to fold up some solar arrays that had been deployed for 5 years, and they were really happy. being out there. And the training on the ground that we were given was that we were basically supposed to flip a switch and automatically those arrays would start to fold up and they'd go into their container. It was supposed to take all of a half an hour. Well, we flipped the switch and all of a sudden the arrays start like bunching up on one another, which wasn't supposed to happen. And so the folks on the ground had to go over to one of the buildings where we had a big mock-up of this, and they had to devise a way for us to get this done because the way that we were taught wasn't going to happen. And so the end result was a few days later, they called up a procedure to us. We had two people go out to do the spacewalk, and they took essentially a wrench that they wrapped in non-conductive tape because there are 120 volts coming out of that solar array. And they would actually kind of pluck all the strings to kind of help it fold up. And it was challenging because it was something that we had to do that we hadn't trained for before we left the ground. Everything else that we'd done on the mission, and for every mission, you train at nauseum and you know how to do that procedure in your sleep. This one was a little bit more challenging because we had never practiced it before. The guys were out with a wrench and 120 volts coursing through the solar array. It was just a little scary, but it all worked out perfectly.
Yeah, I'm glad. That sounds like it'd be a really hard situation.
It is. You know, when the guys were going out the door, I was like, please let them be safe. Let them be safe.
So second grader Aiden in Miss Solar's class asks, what was the coolest thing you saw in space?
So the coolest thing I got to see when I was in space was the Aurora Borealis, better known as the Northern Lights. And that's kind of like the green light that is resulting from disturbances in the region surrounding the Earth caused by a solar wind. And it's really gorgeous. It's like these little green lights that are dancing all around in the sky. And we got to see that for 2 consecutive night passes. I have never seen that on Earth. I had to go to space to actually see it.
That's really cool. It's hard to imagine how like awe-inspiring that must have been.
It was. I mean, it was magical, if I could say that. It was really gorgeous and very magical.
So we have an audience question. Naya wants to know how you felt when you came back from space.
Oh, when I came back from space, I felt like I weighed 400 pounds. Gravity is heavy, and we don't know that because we live in it every day and we're used to it. But if you go away for 2 weeks and come back and you try to deal with gravity, it's heavy. We had landed and we were being extricated. They were taking us out of the shuttle, and I was up on the flight deck, and I stood up for the first time and I just fell back down in my seat. And one of the crew who had come in to help us out, he said, well, take off your parachute because it weighed 40 pounds. I was like, oh, good idea. So I took off my parachute. I stood up, I fell right back down in my seat. And he says, you know, just take your time, get your legs about you. So what I did, I was actually, if you, I'm gonna give you the example of it's like a 4-seater car. So there are 2 people up front, you have the pilot commander, I was in the back, and there was someone next to me. So I was in the back seat, if you will. So I put my hands up on the front seat, I lifted myself over, I kind of shuffled over to the ladder, turned around, got down the ladder, and then I had to turn around because the hatch was to my back. So I turned around, and the hatch is at a lower level than the ladder is. So I actually had to get on my knees to crawl out of the hatch. So I get on my knees, I crawl out of the hatch, and you know, you have all the flight doctors there, and I just looked up at them and I said, I've fallen and I can't get up. So they actually had to help me up. So gravity is really heavy. It took me a good 45 minutes to walk normally and not slap my feet on the ground. So it takes a little while to get readjusted to this very heavy gravity that we live in.
Wow. Yeah, I couldn't imagine just like feeling like you weigh so much and then having to get used to like walking again.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things we can't do when we come back for a couple of days. We can't drive because our depth perception is a little bit off. You know, you're kind of weak because you've not used your lower extremities, your legs very much. So your legs are a little weaker. And then, oh, the other thing I've got to tell you. So when you're in space, you actually grow because there's no gravity acting on your spine. So I grew about 1/2 inch. Fortunately, you don't get to do that. So I wish I could because I'm only 5'3.5".
That's cool. I didn't know that you grew in space.
Yeah, one of the things that we do, we always measure ourselves when we're up there so that we can figure out how much we've grown.
So when you retired from NASA, what did you do next in your career?
When I retired from NASA, I did something and completely different than space. I went to work for an oil company. And the first thing that I did is I worked on one of their proprietary technologies. I did that for a while, then I worked on contracts for a while, and I worked on budgets for a while, trying to learn the business and then figure out where I fit. And what I ultimately ended up doing was running their malaria program in Equatorial Guinea, Africa, which was a very, very unique experience.
Wow, that's cool. Can you tell us more about your job at Collins Aerospace now?
Sure. So with Collins Aerospace, I've actually kind of come full circle and gotten back into the space realm. So there are a lot of companies now that are still in the space business. So Lockheed Martin has a vehicle that's going to eventually go to the moon. SpaceX has a vehicle that's going to and from the International Space Station. Boeing is getting their vehicle ready that's going to go to and from the International Space Station. So my job is to work with these companies and offer them different things that we have to help them get to space. So one of the things that we do as a company is we make the spacesuit that the astronauts use when they go out and do a spacewalk. We've been doing that for nearly 40 years. But there are also other things that we use, that we make. We make what we call ECLSS. That's the Environmental Control and Life Support System. So if you think of anything that you need to have the creature comforts of living in space, like air, water, heat, those things, we produce the machinery that makes those things possible for the environment, for the astronauts to live in a very comfortable environment on the space station.
I bet your astronaut experience is useful for that.
It is useful because I can actually tell them how well it worked or how well it didn't work. So,
So 7-year-old Kalina wants to know, what do you enjoy about being an engineer?
So what I enjoy about being an engineer is being able to solve problems and working with teams to look at problems very differently. It's the whole thing about curiosity and wanting to look at things a different way and solve different problems. That really speaks to who I am and really like gets me very excited.
Yeah, that seems like that would be very rewarding.
It is.
So when you were in school, what was a subject that was challenging for you?
So I didn't have any subjects that were necessarily challenging. I always loved math and science. Those two were my favorite. So if I had to say something was challenging, I would say history, only from the fact that it wasn't necessarily all that enjoyable for me. But I always did well in my school, and I love going to school, which sounds a little crazy, but it was I liked school a whole bunch.
That's cool. So what is one piece of advice that you would give kids who think they might want to be an astronaut or engineer when they grow up?
So I'm going to take that one piece, I'm going to and turn it into three because they all kind of go hand in hand. So the first thing is that you need to believe in yourself, because I think throughout your life you'll probably find people who may doubt you or your abilities. And so if you don't believe in yourself, you won't have other people that will believe in you. The second thing is hard work, because STEM as a whole is challenging. It's challenging, but it's not impossible. And so it takes a lot of hard work to get through a STEM curriculum, but it is definitely worthwhile. And the third piece is perseverance. And I say that because if I hadn't tried a second time to apply to be an astronaut, I would not have had all these incredible opportunities. So perseverance is also something that goes hand in hand with believing in yourself and hard work.
Yeah, that sounds like really wise advice.
Yeah.
So 10th grader P who asks, what thought at the back of your mind has kept you going in your career even when facing difficulties?
The thought that has kept me going is that life in general is a series of ups and downs, good times and bad times. And you know that the bad times are not going to last forever, and it's just a moment in time and you'll get through it. So to me, weathering the storm is an easy thing, and continuing on to do things to get to your goal is the most important thing.
I could see how that would be very motivating.
Yeah.
So Miss Berg's 4th grade are wondering if you ever felt intimidated as a woman working in a field that, historically speaking, has typically been a male-dominated field.
So there have been times, especially earlier in my career, where I may have felt intimidated because someone has had more experience than me and they've been around, and I would think, well, they've got to know it because they've been around. So that may not necessarily be true. But I've learned that as I've grown older and gone further in my career, there is less of an intimidation factor. But yes, it was very male dominated, still is very male dominated. And that's why we need more women to go into the STEM field. And I'm here to root all of you on.
Well, that sounds really inspirational. So many students are asking about the exciting landing of the Perseverance rover on Mars 1 week ago. What was your reaction when you heard the news?
It was phenomenal. So I actually watched the last I think 20 minutes or so as they were coming in, and I could really relate because when I used to work on the shuttle, you know, you took such pride in your work, and then seeing the shuttle launch and come back successfully was just such a wonderful experience. And so I was just as overjoyed as the people who worked on the, you know, they designed the rover, they built the rover, they tested the rover, they waited 7 long months for it to get to Mars. And then it came down to like the last 7 minutes, you know, as they were either going to make it or break it through the atmosphere. And I was holding my breath along with them and just as excited when they got down. It's just so exciting to see that level of technology and all the things that we can accomplish. So yeah, I'm a big space geek, and I'm always looking at the pictures that they're sending back, and to hear the wind on Mars is really incredible. So I will be following that as closely as I can.
Yeah, it's so cool that we can like hear and see what the rover's experiencing on Mars.
Exactly, and that's 300 million miles away. That's just phenomenal.
Do you think that astronauts will travel there soon?
So they will travel that. Soon is a relative term. I would say, if I had to guess, not before the next decade. So I would say 2030 at the earliest. You have to understand that right now with our technology, and depending on when you launch and you know everything being in phase, it's a minimum 7 to 9 months one way, right? And if we can shorten that, it would have a better chance of getting people there and back in a safer configuration. So we will absolutely get there. That I have no doubt. It's just a matter of when. I say at least a decade.
So Miss Snyder's middle school class asked, "Do you like the way the food in space tastes? And did you have a favorite meal?"
I did like the way the food tastes. And the good thing about it is that we had a food tasting class. So we went in one day and everything that was available to put on the menu, they had little cups, you know. And so you got to taste this and got to taste that. And then you got to actually select your menu. And if you didn't want to have the chore of selecting your menu, the dietitians would select a menu for you. My most favorite thing, I do believe, was the beef enchiladas, which for some reason tasted a lot spicier in space than they did in that taste testing class. And so that was one of my favorite meals. My commander actually had he had shrimp cocktail at every single meal. He had
Wow.
lunch and dinner. Yeah, that was a bit much for me.
That's cool. I didn't know that you got to have like a taste testing class.
Yeah, because they want to make sure that you have so many calories per day, and you want to make sure while you're up there that you're eating right. So you don't want to send food that the crew is not going to eat. So the best practice is to make sure you send things up there that they're actually going to eat, so that they'll have energy to do all the different tasks that need to get done.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, what do you do when you're not at work? What are your hobbies and interests?
I am a regular person when I am not at work. So I like to read, and I've been reading just voraciously since we've been in this pandemic. I've just been going through books like crazy. I like to work out, which it's been a real bummer that I've not been able to go to the gym. Even though it opened recently, I'm just not comfortable going yet. So I've been doing my little makeshift workouts here in my house. I bought another stationary bike, and I have some weights, and like it's almost 70 degrees in Charlotte today. So I'm going to go out for a walk in the afternoon. And then I spend time with my family, and every so often go do some retail therapy.
That sounds like fun. So we have one last question. What do you think about the future of space travel? When do you think it will be a common way to travel, like flying on an airplane?
Wow, so that's going to be a little bit down the road for a couple of reasons. First of all, right now, with the vehicles that are being ready for tourists or non astronaut flyers, the cost to fly right now is, I think the cheapest is $250,000. And I don't know that too many people have that amount of money just sitting around discretionary that they can toss on a flight. So it has to get to a place where it's being done more routinely so that it is cost effective, like flying on an airplane. The other thing is we probably have to figure out how to do safety rules of having people fly on, to space. There has to be certain levels of safety so that it will be okay for someone who's not a professional to fly. So with all that, gosh, again, crystal ball, maybe 10, 12 years. But I tell you what, I'll be the first one to say, hey, I'll take the first group up. No problems.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Me
So
too.
I believe that that's all the questions we have time for today. So now it's time to introduce our hands-on challenge. Let's watch this Discover Engineering Challenge video featuring Ms. Higginbotham.
Hi, I'm Joan Higginbotham, an electrical engineer for Collins Aerospace and retired NASA astronaut. In December of 2006, the crew of STS-116 and I launched into the night sky aboard Space Shuttle Discovery on a 13-day mission to the International Space Station. Today, I have a mission for you. The mission is to design an aircraft that falls as slowly as possible before landing in a specific target area. Let's break down the Slow It Down challenge using the engineering design process. You can find written instructions for this activity on Discover E's website. Here are the specs. First, your aircraft must be dropped from a height of at least 6 feet. Second, the aircraft must land within the target area you mark on the floor. And third, you can only use the following materials to build your aircraft: 5 sheets of paper, 1 index card, 4 paper clips, and Scotch tape. So start by brainstorming some designs. What do objects that fall gently and relatively slowly have in common? Think about feathers or maple seeds. Are there clues in their shape or weight? When you start building your aircraft, test it along the way by dropping it from lower heights, maybe 3 feet, then 4 feet. You get the idea. And when you're done and you're ready for the big 6-foot drop, get a timer and take a few practice test flights. Is it working like you thought it would? Are there improvements you can make to increase the amount of time it takes to land? Now, the last step of the design process is to share your results. Let us know how you did. You can email photos to Discover E or post videos on social media using hashtag DiscoverEChallenge. Good luck.
I hope that you all will try this hashtag Discovery Challenge and be sure to share your results with us. Thank you, Ms. Higginbotham, for introducing today's challenge and for joining us today.
Thank you, Tiffany. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in. When you leave today, please fill out our survey. And be sure to join us for our next Chats with Changemakers. Tune in on Friday, March 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time when we will chat with Maria, a research chemist at 3M who develops materials to use in our daily lives to stick and not stick. Until next time, I hope everyone has a great time trying the Discovery Challenge.